Good evening. I'm Beth Keller from Highland Park Public Library. We'd like to welcome you to tonight's special event with Dawn Turner, the author of the acclaimed Three Girls from Bronzeville, a uniquely American memoir of race, fate, and sisterhood. Tonight, she's joined in conversation with WBEZ's Jason Marck. Tonight's program is part of our ongoing Meet the Author series and is sponsored by the Friends of the Library. Please note that tonight's event is being recorded. As an attendee tonight, your microphone and camera are turned off. Closed captioning has been enabled. You can turn on or off the closed captioning by clicking on the live transcription or more icon at the bottom of your screen. Following tonight's event, there will be a question and answer session. You can submit your questions throughout the evening by clicking on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen and typing in your questions. Thanks to the bookstall for supporting this event with online sales of Three Girls from Bronzeville. You can find a link to purchase the book in the chat box. And now I'd like to introduce our guests. We're so pleased and honored to welcome Dawn Turner, an award-winning author and journalist. Her most recent book, Three Girls from Bronzeville, a uniquely American memoir of race, fate, and sisterhood, which she's discussing tonight, won the inaugural Pattis Family Foundation Chicago Book Award. Congratulations, Dawn. Her memoir was also named a notable book of 2021 by the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Chicago Tribune, BuzzFeed, Library Journal, among others. Dawn, who served as a 2017 and 2018 juror for the Pulitzer Prize in commentary, has written commentary for the Washington Post, PBS NewsHour, CBS Sunday Morning News Show, NPR's Morning Edition Show, The Chicago Tonight Show, and elsewhere. She's reported from around the world and has held fellowships at Harvard University and the University of Chicago. In 2018, she established the Dawn M. Turner and Kim D. Turner Endowed Scholarship in Media at her alma mater, the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Dawn is joined in conversation this evening with WBEZ's Jason Marck. Jason has been a broadcaster for more than 30 years. In that time, he's produced, programmed, and hosted a wide variety of radio formats and genres, from jazz to alternative rock to sports talk. He's worn a number of hats at Chicago Public Media's WBEZ since 2004 and can be heard regularly on WBEZ's weekly podcast, Curious City, on Friday nights as the host of the eclectic music program, Radio Z. Thank you both for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Beth. It's always great to be here. And Dawn, I mean, starting from the end instead of the beginning, I mean, I looked at all the people that you thanked and I'm like, I'm tight with all of these people. And how have we never met before? And we talked about how
it's
crazy,
a sin and a shame.
how crazy that is. But you know what? There are a lot of, these aren't characters because this is real life, but there's a lot of key people in this book. And there's some that I want you to describe to the audience, whether they have read the book or not, just to sort of get a feel for them. First of all, I want you to talk about your mom. Your mom, I don't know what I was expecting, but she's not what I expected. She's an interesting and amazing person in so many ways. What are some of the things about your mom, like her personality and her background, and that stand out to you?
Oh, that's a great question, because my mother has some sayings and the book is riddled with them. And I mean, it's like the things that she comes up with, and sometimes I'm like, where did that come from? And so if I say anything that's remotely funny, it probably is somehow related to something our mother has said. But I will go back a little bit before my mom, because she clearly is a product of her parents and grandparents. And my great grandparents arrived in Chicago in 1916 as part of that first wave of the Great Migration. And they were fleeing the ravages of the Jim Crow South, Mississippi specifically. And they came to Chicago looking for the promised land. And they brought all of that color with them, and the hope of the American dream. And they got here, and for a while that was the case. But then the area started to, I mean, first of all, so many Black people, as a lot of people know, came, and the city relegated them to a very specific area of town, and it was disparagingly called the Black Belt. But years later, it was affectionately known as Bronzeville, a way to elevate people and how they feel about themselves. And so, but the housing started to fall onto hard times. The area was policed differently, and so the opportunities were very different as well. And my grandmother would say that they did what Black people have often done, and they took a bunch of scraps and stitched together a world. And that was the world that this area in Bronzeville, that was the area that my grandmother grew up in, and my mother and her sister grew up in. And 50 years after the family first arrived there, it's where my sister, my best friend, and I grew up.
Yeah, I mean, the neighborhood of Bronzeville is a character in many ways in this story. And as you mentioned, the neighborhood itself changes over time, just as individuals change over time. Now, you gave a little bit of a hint, but to me, and from what I know, let's say even before your time in the 30s and 40s and 50s, Bronzeville, from what I understand, was in many ways akin to Harlem and the things that were happening in the Harlem Renaissance. Sort of explain to people who aren't really familiar with everything there was a lot of exciting things and a lot of amazing people in Bronzeville during that era.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, some of the country's most esteemed Black folks lived in Bronzeville. You had Gwendolyn Brooks, I still bow at her writing altar. She was the first Black person to win the Pulitzer Prize. You had novelist Richard Wright, who lived there, the anti-lynching activist and journalist Ida B. Wells, Dr. Daniel Hale Williams, a Black man who was the first heart surgeon to perform the very first successful heart surgery. So by the time that Deborah, Kim, and I were growing up there, over a half century after my great-grandparents arrived, we inherited this legacy of innovation and excellence regarding the arts and sciences and entrepreneurship. But the community was also deformed by a history of redlining and restrictive housing covenants. And that made some places simply unsafe, and some dreams really just unattainable. So it was very much a complicated place, just like Harlem. It's interesting because as I've traveled or at least, traveled via Zoom, a lot of it, for the book, people throughout the country and actually around the world, they've heard of Harlem, but they have not heard of Bronzeville.
That's fascinating. Now, so I'll get to sort of eventually what happens to Bronzeville and neighborhoods like that in just a little bit, but describe Bronzeville in the 70s when you were growing up, and what do people think they know about Black Chicago at that time that they don't really know? I mean, you said when you went away to college that you only knew white people from the Brady Bunch, yes. And white people only knew Black people from the nightly news. Right. Okay, so that stood out to me. So, I mean, what do you think? What should people know about Bronzeville and Black Chicago generally in the 70s that they don't know?
Well, the white people I knew, I had a few white teachers, but my white peers, I had very few to zero white peers growing up. My sister, my best friend, and I were coming of age in the 1970s, and it was in the afterglow of the civil rights movement, at a moment when our parents believed that the country was finally amenable to giving us the opportunities that it had denied generations. And we were going, I mean, they saw us going to college, and we were going to have great paying jobs and become homeowners and partake of the American dream. But that dream would prove to be elusive for Kim and Deborah. But what we had at that time in the 1970s, we were growing up in a privately owned apartment complex that was developed by John H. Johnson, the Black publisher, as well as Dr. Theodore K. Lawless, who was a world-renowned dermatologist. And they wanted something. There was public housing for people, for the very poor. And then there was a complex like Meadows for people who were more middle class, and they would be headed toward home ownership fairly soon. The apartment complex was like a stopover point. But for people in the middle, let's say working class people, it was a really wonderful prototype for affordable housing. But this complex was beautiful. The janitors chased down garbage with a religious fervor. The grass was, manicured, and the playgrounds were incredibly colorful. And so that was part of what we were going to have as this generation following civil rights, that we were going to live in this place that was just beautiful. And then as the community changed, then you could kind of understand what was going on across the street in the housing project. By our fence, we became a gated community, and the fence evolved from chain link to wrought iron. And the teachers, our teachers at the time, people poo-poo public education or Chicago public schools sometimes. And I mean, I am a product of Chicago public schools, and our teachers felt very similar to our parents in that we were that generation that we were going to they were going to position us so that we would be ready to be in these places where a lot of them didn't get a chance to go. And so our teachers, and it sounds really strange now because, you think about taking a class on public transportation on Saturday down to the Art Institute. How many forms would need to be filled out for that? I mean, that would not happen. But my second grade teacher, and I mention her all the time because she's still alive and we're still in contact, but she would take us to museums on Saturdays. She would take her Saturday and ferry us children around. We would go to the Museum of Science and Industry, the Field Museum, Orchestra Hall, the Art Institute, just to expose us to different, to not just different areas of town, but to different lifestyles, and to show us what creativity looked like. And for some, my sister and I were very lucky in that we got a chance to travel throughout the country because of our church. But there were a lot of kids who did not. And so if it had not been for her and some other teachers kind of expanding and giving them a little bit more of a panoramic view of the world, which does that inward as well, which helps you to see yourself differently, they wouldn't have had a lot of that. So, kudos to clearly a different time, but we were really, I'll never forget my sixth grade teacher who had us keep a little file, I don't know, a little tiny file cabinet. I can't think of what those things are, with the little cards. And we would have to put a new word, loquacious, sesquipedalian. We'd have to put a new word in there like every day. And, back then, I don't know how often that was done. I know you can go and look at an app and learn a word a day now, but that was something that was really important to her, and that we spoke in a way that we use the words in class. You may not have used them on the playground, but it was okay to use them in class.
Well, that helps me sort of understand a little bit better what things were like in Bronzeville at that time. Let's talk about, if you're the first of three girls from Bronzeville, let's talk about the second of the three girls in the title. This is your younger sister, Kim. Paint a picture for us, physically, her personality. Who was Kim?
Yeah. Oh my goodness. I like to say that I met her in 1968 when I was 3 years old and our parents brought her home. She was from the very, very beginning a mystery to me. She was just headstrong, willful, and for me, rules were scaffolding. So I was not a perfect kid, but I kind of wanted to know where the boundaries were. But my sister, she did not care. But she was incredibly smart, had a great proficiency for math, and just very curious. But she was also the type of kid, as I said, I mean, she pushed against the rules. So she was a type of kid. Now, if you could direct her, if you could, whether teacher or parent, if you had a little bit more agency with that type of kid who's a little bit of an maybe not quite an outlier, but I think that her personality is very much akin to someone who might someone who has a discipline to start a tech a tech company or something like that, just kind of out things. Definitely, I hate the things out of the box, but that was my sister. Beautiful, energetic, and incredibly kind. And I know that, people say that about their siblings, but I mean, when we fought a lot, but she was definitely team Dawn and I was team Kim.
Yeah. Let's talk about the third of the three girls. Her name is Deborah Trice. Talk about your first encounters with Deborah.
Oh my gosh. I met Deborah in the second grade. We were 7 years old. And because our teacher organized us according to height, I was the tallest kid in the class. She was the shortest. Our worlds barely touched. And it wasn't until third grade when the teacher arranged us alphabetically that I was seated across, Dawn Turner seated across from Deborah Trice, that we became friends. And this teacher was a little bit of kind of a hippie. She was a yoga instructor, but she told us, I mean, something that really seemed subversive back in the early 70s, but she said that we could eat fruit in class. And most of the kids brought, the standard fare of apples, bananas, and oranges. But Deborah, seated across from me, brought in a pomegranate. I was just, it's just so different. And then we learned that not only did we live in the same tower, because Lawless Gardens was composed of 3 towers, we lived in the same apartment building, and her apartment, out of like 200 apartments, there were 24 floors, 10 apartments on each floor, 240 apartments. Her apartment was directly above mine. How did that happen? And I would tap on my ceiling and she would tap on her floor because our bedrooms were one atop the other. And we would talk, we would like, let's meet in the stairways or something. But we became best friends.
And you were friends for a long time. When did she and her family eventually move to Indianapolis? I'm trying to remember.
Yeah, no, that's okay. When we entered high school, so they left Chicago in 1979.
So from like third grade on, you were super tight, and in many ways it was, a three-way friendship with you and Deb, but also Kim. And you even talked about how, because they were the 2 youngest siblings in their families, that they had almost more things, similarities about their personality than you and Deb did.
Oh, absolutely. And you're absolutely right, because I always say that Deborah and I were best friends, but Kim and Deborah were soulmates. They both were far more daring than I was. And again, willing to push against the boundaries. But they were, Deborah and I were best friends, but Deborah always had a special place in her heart for Kim. And I think that they were both the younger of two sisters, and they connected. And of course, I mean, who wants to hang out with their younger sister? but Kim always found an advocate and a soulmate in Deborah.
Going to Hyde Park Academy seemed like it was a really important step on your journey and opening you up to all kinds of new experiences. And I think that's when you started first thinking about becoming a writer. I mean, would you say that that's true? And tell us a little bit about how that just started to develop at that time for you.
Oh, sure. I started thinking, I was always an avid reader. I mean, in our house, if we were reading, we didn't have to do chores. And so my sister and I, we were little pragmatists. We just thought, okay, we're going to read. We don't have to wash dishes. We don't have to sweep. We're good. And so, as you know, reading and writing kind of go hand in hand. And so I loved writing, but I wasn't certain that I could make a life, a living out of, just being a writer. And so I went to college thinking that I would become a doctor. And I got there, and when the first time I got the writing bug was when I wrote a piece on, I think it was the 20th anniversary of the King March, the 1963 March. And so I wrote a piece for the Griot, which was the African-American newspaper, campus newspaper. And that I loved it. I fell in love with it, and I switched to journalism.
Nice. And now I loved your description of the community coming together and the pride that they all felt for you the day that you drove off to college. Talk a little bit about that. Describe some of that.
Oh my gosh. I mean, it's interesting because of course, at the time I took it for granted because I just felt like, well, I'm surrounded by people who love me, and everybody should be surrounded by people who love them. And so the janitors knew that I was leaving because at some point they had to hold the elevator so that, my parents were divorced at this time, but they could pile all of my things on the elevator. And so as people started to, as they learned I was leaving, they started to gather in the lobby of the building. And when I stepped off the elevator, my parents were outside in their individual cars, and they just started to applaud. And you had these people who didn't make a whole lot of money, but they were pressing like $5 and $10 bills into my palm and patting me on my shoulder. And it was a big deal. It was like, this was something this was a moment that didn't just belong to me, it belonged to them as well. And of course, these were people over the years. If I got on the elevator and did not say good morning, they'd be like, you have to, I don't care what just happened to you. Your face may be screwed up, but you have to, you have to acknowledge us. And so they were part of that extended family. And so I think that that's one of the reasons why they felt like, that my going away, that they needed to be a part of that.
Now, I talked a little bit about, your opportunities at Hyde Park Academy, and then, having the opportunity to go off to college. And since I work at a place like WBEZ, I've learned how there has been historic institutional intent to deny people of color in Chicago the opportunity to live where they want, to deny the loans needed to start businesses and buy homes that create generational wealth, to go to schools that are fully funded, to have access to decent health care or even decent grocery stores, and so much more. And I know this stuff to be fact, even as today, politicians around the country, certain of them, rant about how learning these truths will somehow make children hate themselves or their country. And quite frankly, the current Supreme Court majority seems to want to roll back any possible help that Black kids might have had over the last 40 years when it comes to going to college. And the bootstraps people, I'll say in quotes, might say, well, look at Dawn. She worked hard. She kept her nose clean. She's successful. She proves our point. So what do you say to that? This goes, a little bit outside of just the story of the three, of your sister and your friend, but this sort of goes to, the core of questions about opportunity and people who come from different places who have different outcomes. What do you say to arguments like that? And how important, talk about just sort of the importance of opportunities.
Oh, no, this is part of the core of the book, opportunities and access. And so, I have always felt, there but for the grace of God go I. And it's I remember when I wanted to write about Deborah the first time in the pages of the Chicago Tribune, in the perspective section. And an editor said to me, well, why is her story important? And they're supposed to ask that because, so what about this story is different? And I said to him, well, if I tell you, well, first of all, and I don't, we talked about, this isn't a spoiler alert or anything. So Deborah was about to go on trial for murder. And I wanted to write about her case. And he said, well, we write about, murder cases all the time. Why is this one different? And I said to him that, well, if I tell you that we grew up in the same place and, there are a lot of stories, and I know that people who are in these types of situations, everybody has their own story, but I happen to know her story intimately. And I said to him, and one of the reasons why this has haunted me is because I believe that there but for the grace of God go I. And he said, oh, that could never have happened to you. And, and at that time I was just, I could feel the heat rising, my temperature rising, because the reality is that, first of all, any of us can plan to be in one place, and then something can happen to derail that. But I think that is particularly true. Our steps are particularly fraught when you're an African American, when you're a person of color. And I just said, you think there is a degree of privilege if you, in that whole thought process, if you think that, you are destined to land where you plan to be. And so I have felt that, there were differences between Deborah and me, between Kim and me. But, you never know what is going to befall you, what's going to happen in your life that will change everything, that will change your trajectory. And so that's one of the reasons why, as a journalist, I've always been interested in stories about people who are able to, get back. They stepped off the path, and then they were able to claw their way back. And that has always been something that's fascinating to me. And my sister did not quite make it, but Deborah was able to do that. And so, but it is that, it's your life is not over even when you've done something bad. If you can if you can, reconcile, and if you can remake yourself.
When do you think your sister started to, I guess, for lack of a better word, turn?
Yeah.
You talk about an episode where you come back from college your freshman year for Thanksgiving, and there's an incident and you end up calling the cops. But when do you, I think you even talk about the fact that sometimes you don't see things that you don't want to see, and you don't feel things that you don't want to feel, even though they're actually happening. When do you think that you and your mom and your family started to, I guess, quote unquote, lose her?
Yeah, I've been in part of the examination in the book. I didn't want this to be just a book about memory. I conducted interviews, I looked through court documents and revisited old letters and all of that. And so to try to find that exact moment, like anything is just kind of, there is this whittling away sometimes. My sister, as I said, was just very different in terms of rules. And she kind of took she took paths that I just thought, whoa, you're staying out late. I don't that didn't compute initially. But what really happened, what led to her downfall, my mother always preached against teenage pregnancy. My mother was just so afraid that she was just talking about how important it was for us to just wait until you're married, and even then wait until, you're ready to have a child, because it's such a huge responsibility. And my sister got pregnant at 17. And then when she lost the baby, that devastated her. So that was very clearly a moment that I can mark as how even it seemed like her molecules changed. And at the time, we didn't, back in the 80s, we didn't know a whole lot about mental health care in terms of mourning. And so what she did was she used alcohol to self-medicate, and wound up going to, so down, deep down the rabbit hole. And it was very difficult to get her back.
Your sister asked you, as you were packing up your mom's apartment at one point when she was moving, I think that this is after she lost the baby.
Yes.
She asked you, how do you move forward? How are you, Dawn? All right, always looking forward. She was reaching out to try to almost sort of find your secret. Did you think that you had that trait?
I didn't at the time. I do now know that I'm pretty good at compartmentalizing. Because when I started to go back into the past, to take out that metaphorical trunk of stuff and go through it, it was like, oh my God, I forgot this happened. I forgot that happened. So that was a process in itself, but it did speak to my ability to just, I feel the pain and I deal with that and the grief of different things. And then I keep going. I try not to linger in that space. And what precipitated that question from my sister is that we were leaving, we were helping my mother pack. And we had found the aspirator that the paramedics had used to try to revive the baby, because the baby came one night unexpectedly, kind of out of the blue, and my sister was still at home. And I was at college, actually. And so she had saved, and that's when I realized that she was still, the baby was kind of a little phantom in the room. And she was still grieving for this child, because I had found the aspirator before that day of the move. So my sister was looking for me to give her some advice, and I really couldn't, because I had no, I didn't know, I didn't have a name for it. I mean, and it seems trite to say, well, you just move on, because that's not, not everybody can move on that way. Clearly, I mean, now if someone came to me, I would say, okay, well, we need to get you into therapy, and we need to, and there are different supports that I would suggest. But back then I was maybe, I don't know, 21 or 20. And it was just a difficult, I mean, I didn't know how to answer. All I could do at that moment was hold her.
Yeah. I mean, you were trying to be the best sister you could possibly be, and trying to be the best friend you could possibly be, at the same time that you were having your own difficulties in college. Your freshman year, you document that, and then trying to make it out in the world, and being married and owning a home for the first time, and all that. And you're doing a lot of juggling, quite frankly. And the night that your sister passed, your aunt told you, I think I wrote down this quote: "Hold your head up high, you've been a good big sister."
Mm.
But you said you felt like a failure. What do you think you could, or at least at that time, what did you think you could or should have done differently? And do you still feel that way?
At the time, she and I had gone to an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, and it was a little perfunctory, because I thought, you're not an alcoholic, but let's just do this because mom suspects something there. And so I thought, when she left us, my sister passed, I thought, oh my God, we should have gone to more of those meetings. Or I should have been able to identify it. I mean, she was a 23, 24-year-old who drank alcohol. I mean, that's kind of a rite of passage, especially in college for a lot of young people. She was beyond college, but at college age, in terms of being an undergrad. But, people drank, and I just didn't think. And so I felt like when she died, I felt like I missed something. My sister and I were very much, as I said, we locked horns from time to time, but we were very close. She wrote me, I still have these wonderful letters that she wrote me while I was in college. A few years before, I think a year before I went to college, Alice Walker published The Color Purple. And my sister loved that book. And it's written as a collection of letters. And so my sister wrote me constantly. And so we were very close. And I'm thinking, of all the people on the planet, how did I miss that? And so that's what I felt that night that she died. I'm thinking, and again, she was the first person, not only the closest person to me that I lost, but I had never lost anybody so young. So it was just, I mean, there were so many emotions. I told my mother the other day, actually, and I said, I think I thought I cried for so long, so many days, so many weeks. My mother said, oh my God, I thought you would never stop crying. I mean, I did, because it was just that painful.
How old is your mom now?
I'm sorry, how old is she now?
How old is she now? Yeah.
Yeah, she's a young 86.
Oh, 86. All right. Yeah. I mean, and your granny, who I think your mom got a lot of her hilarious phrases and just sort of worldview about people and things, comes from Granny. Granny is one of my absolute, favorites. We've been talking a lot about your sister Kim, and we don't really have the time, to talk about Deborah's descent and eventual redemption here and now. And people who haven't read about it can read it, and people who have know exactly how incredible it is. You and Deb's sister really never gave up on her, but really, most importantly, in prison, she started to really see herself and understand herself and believe in herself for the very first time. And, one of the most emotional parts of the book for me has to do with the power of forgiveness.
Yes.
First, the mother of the man that she killed forgives him, and then eventually the mother and daughter, I mean the wife and the daughter of the man. And this whole idea of forgiveness, and your church growing up is another almost character, and the characters that are in the church are actual characters. I mean, with big personalities. The church was central to your family, and forgiveness is perhaps the central tenet of Christianity. And when I think about it, there's a lot of forgiving going on in this book. Why is forgiveness of not just others but yourself, so important to this story and moving, in life?
Right. Oh, Jason, I mean, that's really important. The whole notion of forgiveness. Well, first of all, when we think of forgiveness, I mean, it really works in theory, but when we have to put into practice, that's a whole nother thing. And so with Deborah, I got a chance to sit in the reconciliation meeting with her and her victim's family. And I remember Terry Jones, who's the widow, who's just amazing. She had said that she would never forgive Deborah when the murder first happened. And Raymond Jones, who's the victim, his mother instantaneously forgave Deborah and wrote her for years until she died, wrote Deborah in prison. And what I learned through this reconciliation meeting in 2018 was that, I mean, they had it toward the end. The next year, Deborah would be released, and she was sentenced to 50 years, and she had to do 25, but she got some years deducted because of, she went to college while in prison, and just rehabilitation things. And I have to say that the Indiana women's prison system, one of the faults of our national prison system is that it's more of a warehousing entity as opposed to rehabilitation. But Deborah was able to transform her life there with the support of the various programs while in prison. And so when I sat in on that meeting, it was, I like you, I'm a seasoned journalist, and it was just amazing to witness, first of all, the woman who said that she would never forgive Deborah, say that I've come here today to say I forgive you. And the daughter who just wanted to understand what happened on the night that her father died. And they remain friends. And so that forgiveness is incredibly liberating. And one of the reasons why Deborah is doing so well today is because the victim's family, and not all of them, but the two, I think, or the three really integral people, the son and daughter and the widow, I mean, they have embraced her. Deborah is on their foundation. They have an anti-gun foundation, gun violence foundation, and Deborah's a part of that. And I mean, they literally, and so it wasn't just that they forgave her in that moment during, while we were all gathered in the prison, but that has continued. And that is what I mean by forgiveness in theory versus forgiveness in practice. They really are. They're a testament to just the power of it. And I know that sounds a little cliche, but it really is true.
Now, we focused a lot on Kim and Deborah, but the book is called Three Girls from Bronzeville, after all, you being the third. And you didn't spare yourself, and you didn't gloss over many setbacks that you had. And sometimes the hardest truths we face are the ones about ourselves. So what was the toughest part of Dawn's story for you to piece together and put into writing?
Well, I mean, I had a fantastic editor at Simon and Schuster. Christine Pride was the editor of my dreams. And this is such a very difficult book to write. But one of the things that we were very clear on from the beginning, and that she helped me, was that we wanted it to be about three girls. There was this braid and so I did not want this to be a book saying, oh, look at me, I did everything perfectly. They didn't. It was a book about three girls and our challenges were very different. And so that was what I wanted to make sure that I came across. I mean, you could see my foibles, you could see the things that I kind of did right, the things I kind of did wrong, and just the challenges along the way.
Yeah, but I'm specifically thinking, and maybe I'm pushing. I don't want to push
No,
too
that's
much.
okay.
No, I feel like sometimes it's easier to write about somebody else than it is to
Yes.
write about you, in the same way that people who, who might need to go to therapy, it's hard to just sort of open up
Right.
and think about or talk about yourself in a different way, not necessarily an out-of-body experience, but
No,
sort of
I understand.
self-recognition. I mean,
Right.
what was the toughest part of that process, or the toughest part of the story for you to put into writing?
When I was told since I was a kid that I should go to college. And that was, I mean, my eyes were set on college from a very young age. And I get there, and my freshman year, I am not partying, but kind of, protesting South Africa, divestment, all of that stuff. But just not doing what I'm supposed to do as a student. And so I was invited to leave and given the opportunity to come back, which I did. And then I finished in 4 years, but I had to sit out a semester. A wonderful Dean Robert Copeland, allowed me to come back. He had said in his letter to me that I needed to sit out for a year. And he wanted me to know that it was often far more difficult to return after you've been, asked to leave than to have been accepted in the first place. And so that was one of those challenges. It was incredibly embarrassing, especially after we just talked about the big send-off I had. And it was just something that I determined that I would never be asked to leave like that again, that I would do whatever it was that I needed to do. There are other moments in the book as well that I just wanted to just make sure that people didn't think that, oh, I had everything easy. Every decision I made, there were no obstacles. And I think that was really important to talk about, so that I would be to humanize me in the book as well.
And I know that you've dedicated so much of your professional life to telling stories and to telling individuals' stories. But I was like, as I'm reading this, I'm wondering, is this one of those stories like that you wrote for the Trib that you needed to get out, okay? Or was this about answering questions that you had inside yourself?
Oh, that's a great question, because I think of it as a book that I pursued. I had veiled attempts in telling, and interviewing other people and telling their stories. But it's a book that I pursued and that pursued me. And as I started to write, I didn't think of it as being cathartic, but I hope that some of the stories would have to some degree universal appeal. The story of siblings and how you can come from the same two people and be very different people. And that is something that's universal. I remember an editor, a white man who had grown up on the North Shore, when I wrote the story about Deborah graduating from college in prison. And I remember him saying that he had gone to New Trier, and he had a friend that was an alcoholic, and his path was vastly different from what they, other people had imagined. So there, the characters are African American, most of them, especially the main three. But I think that we all know somebody who kind of veered. And now the details are very specific, but that whole, how it changed, how that moment when your friend or your sibling doesn't quite live up to what that potential that they once saw in themselves and everybody saw in them. I mean, how that changes not just them, but you being proximate to them. That is something that I think is universal.
Well, I think that might be a great place to end. I mean, you and I could talk all, we could fill up a couple of glasses of wine and go all night. But I think that Beth, there might be some people out there in the listening audience that might have some of their own questions for Dawn.
Yes. Well, first of all, I want to thank you, Dawn and Jason, for such a great conversation this evening. We do invite you all to submit your questions using the Q&A box. At this time, a very brief poll is going to pop up on your screen so that we know how many people are joining us. So if you could just take a few seconds to answer that, that would be great. And then we'll move on to Q&A. Thank you.
It says hosts and panelists cannot vote.
Yeah.
So I'm not voting. I'm not voting.
Thank you. So we've had a few questions and a couple comments. One comment said that the book Three Girls from Bronzeville seems to be great. And congratulations, hoping the book will be available in the library. So yes, the book is available in the library, and also you can purchase a copy from the bookstall, which is partnering with us this evening, and you can find a link to purchase the book in the chat. So let's see, so moving on to some questions. Lynn asked, do you think that because you had two strong mentors, like fathers, she put in quotes, to guide you, and she didn't, and I think she's referring to your sister, Dawn, was that the cause for your success and her failures? Was she looking to you to be her mentor?
Oh, I mean, that's a great question. Thank you, Lynn. I got very lucky. I think that the part of my personality was to kind of align myself with people who were kind of going in the direction that I wanted to go in. And both my mentor, one of whom was Dean Copeland, who I mentioned, but the other was my future father-in-law. He was an incredible like surrogate dad. And so I do think that that's one of the differences, but it's hard to say what was the major difference. But I do encourage people, especially young people, to have mentors and people who can to mentor.
Thank you. Someone was asking if you could give us an update on Deborah. I know you mentioned that she works with the Family Foundation, or she's part of, she works with the Family Foundation. Are there other updates that you can share?
Yes, Deborah works for a medical supply company. Again, the prison system was excellent in terms of preparing her for her release. And so she spent a year before her release working and leaving the prison to go work a full-time job. And so she got, and before she left, she had all of her documents to get her driver's license and all of that. So she just bought a new car. She's got this great job at a medical supply company that, I mean, COVID, horrible, but this company she works for has thrived because of, in part because of the virus, and she's doing well.
That's great to hear. Thanks for the update. Lauren mentioned that the book was great. We read it for our book group last year.
Thank you.
So I know it's nice to hear comments like
Yes.
that. And then someone was asking about the community of Bronzeville now. Is it different than when you were there? Can you tell us a little bit about Bronzeville today?
Yeah, it is very different. The public housing projects that had been there in Bronzeville, I mean, had really there was such a there were so many of them there and it was so unfair to have one community have that much public housing. But because of the neglect and the decay, the housing projects had been such challenging places. They were torn down as part of the city's plan for transformation. But the challenge is as they start to rebuild, because there's a lot of property there that's still vacant. But the challenge is to make sure that in this community where now you can get a brownstone for $500,000, $750,000, and the prices, the property values are definitely competitive, but it's a community that needs more affordable housing. And I mean, just really good, solid, well-kept, affordable housing. And as I said earlier, that model that I grew up in, where, you know, we had the shiny stainless steel elevator doors and the people in the lobby, it was, I think that was a good prototype for what can be done when you have people who maintain property, and also who are just make sure that people, you know, that the residents do what they need to do to keep it up. Because we do, I mean, where we live, I mean, it's so important to who we are. We internalize that stuff. You live amid garbage, you live amid squalor, then it's hard to really not have that be a part of your psyche and your soul.
Someone asked, what was your favorite book of 2022? We know your book came out in 2021.
Yeah. So South to America, it won the National Book Award. And you see all of these little things because I played Jason's role with Imani Perry and got a chance to interview her. But that was definitely one of my favorites.
Thank you. We'll put it on our list. Jen, did you want to answer that question? I don't want to put you on the spot, but did you want to answer that question too?
Oh, do I want to answer that question?
Sure.
Oh man, you just put me on the spot. You put me on too much of a spot.
Okay, no worries.
Yes.
I know it's hard
If I think of
sometimes.
something,
He reads so much, he can't pick one.
If I think I'll end up blurting it. I'll end up blurting it out when I think of it. I've been doing a lot. I do a lot of reading. A lot of my reading time ends up being I'm reading to my kids.
Yes.
So I've got an 8-year-old and an 11-year-old. So I worked my way through all the Harry Potter books, and you know, we're working our way through the Kane Chronicles and all of these larger chapter books. So that's a lot of reading. Yes.
Good reading.
Okay, we have one. This is probably a great question to end with. Has your daughter read your book? Diana's asking, has your daughter read your book? And if so, did she learn more about you and her relatives?
Oh, Diana. No, she has not read the book. And I think that there is that kind of, she'll read it at some point. My mom read it, Deborah read it, and of course, I mean, I gave them the book before I gave it to my editor. But no, my daughter has not read my book. She's a good daughter in other ways, but not that way.
And I think that's a great way. Oh, wait, we've got one more comment. I'll just squeeze this in. I love the book, which I read a year ago. This conversation has left me with ongoing thoughts about nurture versus nature and the transformative possibilities of redemption and second chances. Thank you for bringing your story to the world. And I think that's a great way to sum this up. Thank you so much for bringing your story to the world and for us who are here this evening. So thank you so much, Dawn, and thank you so much, Jason. And thank you to the Friends of the Library for sponsoring our event this evening. Thank you so much.
No, thank you. You know, I'll just quickly say, you know, Beth, I mean, it's you know, I'm very lucky to be a member of the Highland Park community. And so I always love doing stuff at the library. My family and I are always in the library. So anytime that I get a chance to do stuff for the library, it's a real honor. It's a real treat. And Dawn, I mean, we're going to have to get a cup of coffee or something like that. But I mean, this book was just not, the stories are amazing, but the writing is just so beautiful that it was really an honor to be able to read it, much less be able to talk to you about it.
Thank
So,
you.
and I wouldn't say that if I didn't really mean that. So thank you. Thank you, you know, Beth, for hooking me up with this assignment, and Dawn, it's been a real pleasure.
Well, Jason, I'm a huge fan of yours. And so I look forward to that coffee. And I want to just say to your readers and to the library, I mean, I grew up going to the library, and libraries are part of my heart. And I also know that people can be reading anything. And so I am so grateful when you choose to read my words. And Jason, you're such a careful reader. And you and Beth, and just really thank you guys so much for having me. It's been an honor.
Thank you guys, and it was an honor for us too, and thanks for the great words about libraries. Lots of thank yous coming through and talking about Love the Book. So thanks. You can find the book at the library and at the bookstall. And thanks everybody. Good night.
Good night.